Tonight, we enter the fragments that survived. We walk the stone corridors where breath hung frozen in anticipation. We stand in the jungle temples where priestesses felt the air change against their skin. We ask the question that was never meant to be asked. What did the bells say? And why was the world so determined to forget? Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and listen for the silence that still waits, patient and ancient, for those willing to hear what was never meant to be spoken aloud. In the vast library of human memory, there are shelves that have been deliberately emptied, books that were written, read and then burned not by conquerors or censors, but by the faithful themselves, stories that those who knew them best chose to unmake, as though the telling itself was a kind of trespass upon something sacred. The night every temple bell rang once belongs to such a shelf. We do not know precisely when this event occurred. The records that survived are fragments, a page torn from a monastery journal, a single paragraph in a Persian astronomical text, a carving on a barn beam in medieval England that mirrors a temple bell in distant Japan. These fragments do not agree on dates. They do not agree on the exact nature of the sound. They agree only on this. Something happened that was so profound, so sacred, so beyond the capacity of ordinary language to contain, that those who experienced it reached an unspoken consensus. This must not be written. This must not be remembered. This must be allowed to dissolve back into the great silence from which all holy things emerge. And yet, here we are, gathering the scattered pieces, listening at the edges of what was meant to be forgotten, not because we wish to trespass, but because some silences, when you press your ear against them, seem to be waiting for someone to arrive. This documentary unfolds in 12 chapters, each one a doorway into a different aspect of the mystery. We begin before the sound, in the strange, thick silence that descended upon sacred spaces across the world, as though creation itself had paused to listen. We move through the night of the ringing, tracing its impossible geography, its witnesses, its aftermath. We explore what happened to the bells, to the bell makers, to the manuscripts, to the monks who chose never to speak again. We ask what the children remembered, what the astronomers noticed, what the dreamers dreamed in the weeks that followed. And we end where all true mysteries end, not with answers, but with a deeper quality of question, with the recognition that some things are not meant to be solved, only to be sat with in the quiet hours when the world outside grows still and the mind turns inward. This is not a history lecture. This is a meditation, a nighttime journey into the kind of territory that maps cannot show. Let the words wash over you like water in a sacred well. Let the images form and dissolve without grasping. Let your breath slow to match the rhythm of ancient corridors, of jungle temples, of mountain monasteries where snow falls past windows that have watched for centuries. The night every temple bell rang once is still happening somewhere, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the moment just before sleep claims you. Listen, it is waiting for you. There are moments in history that leave no monuments. No stone is carved to mark their passing. No scroll is unfurled to record their meaning. They exist only in the spaces between breaths, in the pause before a word is spoken, in the stillness before a door opens onto something vast and unknowable. These moments do not ask to be remembered. They ask only to be felt once by those who were present, and then to dissolve back into the great silence from which all sacred things emerge. This is the story of such a moment. It is said that before any great revelation, the world grows quiet, not the ordinary quiet of night falling over a village, or the hush that settles after the last market stall has closed. This is a different kind of silence, deeper, older, as though the earth itself has turned its attention inward, listening for something approaching from a distance no map could measure. The mystics of many traditions have spoken of this phenomenon. They call it the breath before prophecy, the stillness before the veil parts, the hour when even shadows seem to wait. And on one night, in an age now buried beneath centuries of forgetting, this silence descended upon the world, not in one place, but everywhere, in temples separated by oceans, in shrines divided by mountain ranges no traveler had ever crossed, in sacred spaces that shared no common language, no common God, no common sky. The silence came to all of them at the same hour, as though the world itself had pressed its ear to an unseen door. What followed that silence? The ringing of every temple bell across the known and unknown world has been deliberately erased from most historical records. But before we can understand the sound, we must first enter the stillness that preceded it. We must stand in the cold corridors where monks paused mid-step. We must kneel in the jungle temples where priestesses felt the air change against their skin. We must become, for a moment, witnesses to the hour before the sound, that sacred threshold where anticipation itself becomes a kind of prayer. Let us begin in the mountains, high in the Himalayas, where the air is thin enough to taste the stars. There stood a monastery carved into the living rock. It had no name that has survived. Its monks left no writings that escaped the burning that would come later, but from fragments, a traveler's account, a single page torn from a journal and pressed into the walls of a cave, we know that on this night, a monk was walking through a stone corridor when he stopped. He did not know why he stopped. There was no sound to arrest his movement, no vision to halt his path. His breath hung visible in the cold air, a small ghost that dissolved slowly, as though even it was reluctant to disturb whatever had settled into the space around him. The torches on the walls burned without flickering. The shadows they cast did not move. He stood there, this unnamed monk, in an unnamed monastery, for what he later described as either a moment or an eternity. He could not tell which. Time, he would whisper to a fellow monk years later, had become something else in that corridor. It had become thick, like honey, like the silence before a mother speaks her child's name for the first time. He felt that if he moved, he would disturb something vast and patient, something that was not watching him exactly, but was aware of him in the way that the ocean is aware of every grain of sand upon its shore. Thousands of miles away, in a temple wrapped in jungle vines, where the air was warm and heavy with the scent of frangipani, a priestess experienced the same phenomenon. She was standing before an altar, her hand extended over a bowl of offerings, rice, flowers, a single flame floating on oil. She had been about to complete a gesture she had performed 10,000 times, but her hand stopped, suspended in the humid air, and she found that she could not move it, not would not, could not. The flame in the bowl ceased its gentle dancing. The insects that had been singing their eternal chorus fell silent all at once, as though a conductor had lowered his baton. The priestess felt the hair rise on her arms, on the back of her neck. She felt, she would later tell her sisters, as though the temple itself had inhaled and was holding its breath, waiting for something to arrive through a door that had no location, no hinges, no frame. In the scattered accounts that survived, hidden in private journals, coded into the margins of unrelated manuscripts, whispered from teacher to student in traditions that valued secrecy above all, the descriptions of this hour share remarkable similarities. Remarkable because those who recorded them could not have known of each other's existence. Remarkable because they describe the same sensation using images so similar they might have been drawn from a single dreaming mind. A fisherman off the coast of Greece, whose testimony was preserved only because a local scholar found it amusing enough to copy into his personal notes, swore that the sea flattened to glass beneath his boat, not calm, glass. He could see his reflection in it, clearer than any mirror he had ever owned. And his reflection, he insisted until his death, was not doing what he was doing. His reflection was kneeling, head bowed, as though in prayer or supplication, while he himself stood gripping the mast in confusion. When the sea finally returned to its normal gentle motion, he found that his hands were shaking so badly he could not untie a simple knot. In a village in India, a child turned to her mother and asked a question that the mother would remember for the rest of her life. Why has the wind stopped breathing? The mother looked around. The trees were still. The dust that perpetually hung in the air had settled. The flames of the cooking fire rose straight up, undisturbed by even the slightest breeze. And she realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, that she could not remember the last time she had felt the air move against her skin. It was as though the world had been placed under a great bell jar, sealed away from the currents that normally flowed through every living moment. A Persian manuscript, discovered centuries later in a collection of astronomical observations, contains a single paragraph that appears to have nothing to do with the stars. It reads, "On this night, I set down my instruments, for they could measure nothing of what was occurring. The air became as still as the air inside a tomb that has not been opened for 1,000 years. My servant asked if we should light more lamps, for the darkness seemed thicker than ordinary darkness, as though it had substance, as though it could be touched. I told him no. I told him we were witnessing something that did not want to be seen, only felt. The world, I wrote in my journal, was pressing its ear to an unseen door, and on the other side of that door, something was preparing to knock. What is it that animals know, that humans have forgotten? The accounts from this hour speak again and again of creatures behaving strangely, dogs that lay down and covered their eyes with their paws, cats that sat perfectly still, staring at corners where nothing visible waited, horses that refused to move, their eyes wide and white, their bodies trembling, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of terrible attention. Birds. This detail appears in accounts from every continent, landing wherever they happen to be and folding their wings, as though they had received a command that humans could not hear. In one monastery in Japan, the monks kept a pond of sacred koi. These fish, the monks believed, were sensitive to the spiritual atmosphere of the temple. On ordinary days, they swam in lazy patterns, their orange and white body drifting through the dark water like living prayers. On days of great spiritual significance, the visit of an important teacher, the death of a beloved elder, they would gather in the center of the pond and swim in slow circles as though performing a ritual of their own. On the night of the silence, every a fish in the pond sank to the bottom and remained motionless. The monks, already disturbed by the strange quality of the air, gathered around the water and watched the dark shapes resting on the stones below. One monk reached in and touched a fish, certain it must be dead. It was not. It was merely waiting, as everything seemed to be waiting for something that had not yet arrived, but whose approach could already be felt, like the pressure change before a storm that has not yet appeared on the horizon. We must speak now of time. Those who experienced the hour before the sound describe a strange phenomenon. They could not afterwards say how long it lasted. Some insisted it was only a few minutes, the time it takes for a candle to drip a single drop of wax. Others swore it continued for hours, though the position of the stars did not change, and no candle burned down appreciably in its holder. A few suggested, hesitantly, that it did not last any time at all, that it existed outside of time, in a space where duration had no meaning. This is the testimony of those who dwell in sacred spaces. Time does not flow evenly through the world. There are places where it pools, where it thickens, where it stands still while the rest of creation rushes on. Temples are built in such places. Holy sites emerge around them, and on certain nights, nights written in calendars no human has ever read. These pools of sacred time expand outward, touching each other, connecting across distances that have nothing to do with miles or leagues. Perhaps this is what happened on the night of the silence. Perhaps the sacred spaces of the world, those pools of deep time that exist beneath the surface of ordinary moments, rose up and merged, creating a single vast lake of stillness in which all creatures, everywhere, found themselves suddenly floating. The monk in the mountain corridor, and the priestess in the jungle temple, the fisherman on the glass sea, and the child asking about the wind's breath, all of them standing in the same water, though they could not see each other, though they did not know the others existed. And in that shared stillness, something approached, something that needed silence in order to be heard, something that could only arrive when the world stopped speaking, stopped moving, stopped breathing, and listened. There is a word in ancient Sanskrit that has no equivalent in any modern language. It refers to the moment just before a deity manifests, not the manifestation itself, but the trembling anticipation that precedes it. The word suggests that this anticipation is itself sacred, perhaps more sacred than what follows. For in the anticipation, everything is still possible. The God might appear as light or shadow, as word or silence, as comfort or terror. The devotee stands at the threshold, not knowing what waits on the other side, and that not knowing is a kind of prayer more pure than any prayer that follows revelation. The hour before the sound was this moment, extended across the entire world. Every temple, every shrine, every sacred space became a threshold. Every being within those spaces became a devotee, standing at the edge of something they could not name, but could feel pressing against the membrane that separates the ordinary from the holy. The world became a single held breath, a single suspended heartbeat, a single drop of water trembling at the tip of a leaf, not yet fallen, not yet fallen, not yet fallen. And then, somewhere, everywhere, a bell began to ring. But that belongs to the next chapter of our story. For now, let us remain in the silence. Let us stand with the monk in the stone corridor, his breath a ghost dissolving in the cold air. Let us kneel with the priestess, her hand frozen above the offering bowl. Let us float on the glass sea with the fisherman, watching a reflection that prays while we stand in wonder. Let us be the child, asking the question that no one can answer. Why has the wind stopped breathing? Some say that the hour before the sound never truly ended. They say it still exists, layered beneath the ordinary hours we experience, waiting for those who know how to enter it. In certain temples, at certain times, when the light falls just so and the air grows still, visitors report feeling a strange sensation, as though they have stepped sideways into a moment that is not their moment, a silence that is not their silence. They stand, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling the attention of something vast and patient turning toward them like the beam of a lighthouse sweeping across dark water. And then the sensation passes, The ordinary world reasserts itself. Birds sing, wind blows, time flows in its accustomed direction, and the visitor is left wondering if they imagined it, if it was a trick of the light, a quirk of tired nerves. But somewhere deep inside, they know they have stood at the edge of the hour before the sound. They have felt the world holding its breath. They have been, for an instant, part of that ancient and sacred anticipation, the trembling threshold between silence and revelation, between the question and the answer that has not yet come. And perhaps, if they listen closely enough, they can still hear it. Not the sound, the waiting. Let us close our eyes now. Let us breathe slowly, as the monk breathed in his cold corridor, as the priestess breathed in her jungle temple, as all the creatures of the earth breathed in that impossible hour. Let us feel the air grow still around us. Let us feel time thicken, pool, expand into something vast and patient. For perhaps this is what that night was truly about. Not the sound that would follow, not the bells that would ring across the world, but this, the invitation to wait, to be silent, to feel the sacred approaching, and to know that our only task is to be present, to be still, to listen with everything we are for the word that has not yet been spoken. The hour before the sound is always now. The threshold is always here. And something ancient, something patient, something that has been waiting longer than we can imagine, is always preparing to speak. We need only be quiet enough to hear. To map what happened that night is to draw lines between stars that should never align. It is to trace connections across oceans that no ship of that age could cross, through mountain ranges that stood as impenetrable walls between civilizations, into jungles and deserts where the very concept of the lands beyond was nothing more than myth and whispered legend. And yet, the bells rang together. Imagine a scholar in a candlelit archive, centuries after the event, surrounded by the few documents that escaped the burning. Before him lies a monastery record from Nepal, speaking of a bell that rang without human hand. To his left, a temple log from Kyoto describes the same phenomenon on what appears to be the same night, and in a locked drawer, obtained through means he prefers not to discuss, a fragmented Orthodox chronicle from an isolated Greek island tells of a bell tower that sang a single note to an empty church. He lays a map before him, hand drawn, the continents slightly misshapen in the manner of old cartography, and begins to mark the locations: Nepal, Japan, Greece. As he adds more, the pattern refuses to emerge. The locations share no common latitude, no alignment with known celestial events, no geographical logic whatsoever. They are scattered across the face of the earth, as though a hand had cast seeds into the wind and let them fall where they may. And yet, somehow, every seed took root at the same moment. The mystery deepens when we consider the question of time. The bells, we are told, rang simultaneously. But what does simultaneity mean? In an age before standardized clocks, before telegraph wires, before any mechanism existed that could coordinate action across vast distances, the temples of that era measured time by the sun, by the stars, by the burning of incense sticks and the dripping of water clocks. Each sacred space existed in its own temporal bubble, its own rhythm of days and seasons, and yet the scattered accounts agree on one remarkable detail. The bells rang not at the same clock hour, for clocks themselves were rare and unsynchronized, but at the same celestial moment, specifically when a particular configuration of stars crossed the meridian of each location. This is, from a purely astronomical standpoint, almost impossible to verify. The stars move slowly across human lifetimes, and the records we have do not specify which stars, which configuration, which meridian, but the consistency of the claim that temple keepers who had no contact with each other describe the same celestial trigger suggests something operating beyond coincidence, beyond the explanatory power of mass hysteria or cultural diffusion. It suggests that the bells were listening to the sky. Let us travel now through the soft geography of the sacred, visiting each location as though we ourselves are pilgrims following a route that exists only in the space between maps. In the high mountain temples, where snow muffles everything, the sound of the bell was said to have carried differently. Monks reported that the tone seemed to travel not through the air, but through the stone itself, vibrating up through the floors of the monastery into their feet, their bones, their hearts. One account describes the sensation as being wrung from the inside, as though the listener had become the bell and was resonating with a striker that touched no bronze, but only the deepest substance of being. In the river shrines of Southeast Asia, where temples rose from the water on ancient stilts, the bell's voice was carried downstream for miles. Fishermen who had not been near the temple heard the tone passing them in the current, a sound that moved through water like something alive, like a great serpent made of vibration threading its way toward the sea. Those who heard it said they felt compelled to stop their boats and bow their heads, though they could not have explained why, though they did not know what they were bowing to. In the desert hermitages of the Middle East, where holy men lived in caves carved from sandstone cliffs, the bells had nothing to echo against. The sound, such accounts as exist, tell us seemed to come from inside the listener's own chest. There was no external source, no direction from which it approached. The hermits clutched their robes and wondered if they were dying, if this was the sound one hears at the threshold of the eternal. And many of them, in that moment, reported feeling no fear, only a vast and surprising peace, as though something they had been seeking all their lives had finally arrived to collect them. How did bronze and iron, shaped by hands that never touched, respond to the same invisible summons? Some historians have suggested coincidence, a statistical improbability that nevertheless occurred, as all improbabilities must eventually occur given enough time and enough bells. But this explanation falters when we examine the physical evidence. The bells that rang that night showed wear patterns consistent with a single strike, a fresh mark on ancient metal, a disturbance in the patina of centuries. Some temples had bells that had not been rung in living memory, whose ropes had rotted away generations ago. These bells were found swaying slightly in the morning light, as though something had touched them and departed. Others have proposed mass hysteria, the power of suggestion spreading through populations, causing people to hear what they expected to hear. But this too falls short. The populations in question had no contact with each other. They did not share expectations, did not share myths about simultaneous bells, did not share any context that would prime them for such an experience. And mass hysteria does not leave physical marks on metal. The truth, if we can call it that, seems to be simpler and more unsettling. Something rang the bells, something that was not human, not bound by distance, not limited by the barriers that separate one place from another, something that moved through the world on that night, as though the world were a single instrument and the bells were its strings, waiting to be struck. There is a theory, whispered among those who study such things, that the earth itself is networked with invisible lines of connection. The Chinese called them dragon veins, channels through which energy flows beneath the surface of the land, concentrating in certain places, creating the conditions for sacredness to emerge. Western occultists spoke of ley lines, alignments of ancient sites that seemed too precise to be accidental. Modern researchers have mapped electromagnetic anomalies that correspond, in some cases, to these traditional patterns. What if the temples of the world were built not where humans chose, but where the earth itself invited them? What if sacred spaces emerge at nodes in a vast network that we can sense but not see, feel but not measure? And what if, on certain nights, when certain stars align, this network activates, sends a pulse through its channels, a signal that every receiver tuned to its frequency picks up at once? The bells, in this theory, were receivers, their bronze and iron, shaped by sacred metallurgy and installed in precisely the right locations, became antennas for a transmission that had no sender, or rather, whose sender was the earth itself, or the stars, or something deeper still, something that exists in the space where earth and stars meet. This is speculation, of course. We cannot prove it, but as we stand at the edge of our map, looking at the scattered points that refuse to form a pattern, we find ourselves drawn to explanations that transcend the ordinary. For the ordinary has no place here. The ordinary cannot account for what happened. As we close this chapter, let us return to our scholar in his candlelit archive. He has marked all the locations he can verify. His map is covered with points, but no lines connect them. No shape emerges. No logic reveals itself. And yet, as he stares at the map in the flickering light, he begins to see something, not a pattern in the locations, but a pattern in their very patternlessness. They are distributed, he realizes, as though deliberately scattered, as though whatever placed them wanted to cover as much of the earth as possible, wanted to ensure that no corner of the world was beyond reach. The bells were not clustered in holy lands or concentrated in centers of power. They were everywhere, in the greatest cities and the most remote hermitages, in temples that saw thousands of worshippers, and in shrines that saw only the wind. The message, if message it was not addressed to any particular audience. It was addressed to everyone, to the whole world, ringing at once. The scholar sets down his pen. He looks at his map one more time, and then, slowly, reverently, he rolls it up and places it in a drawer, to be taken out again only by those who are ready to see borders that have no borders, distances that have no distance, a world connected by threads that neither eye nor instrument can detect. The map of that night has no edges. It is still being drawn. Before the night of the ringing, there were the hands that shaped the bells. Before the sound that echoed across the world, there was silence in the foundry, the deep, waiting silence of molten metal cooling into form, of sacred craft passed from master to apprentice through generations uncounted. The making of a temple bell was never merely metallurgy. In every tradition where such bells were cast, the process was wrapped in ritual, in prayer, in preparations that seemed excessive to the uninitiated, but whose purpose, on the night of the ringing, became terrifyingly clear. Let us descend into the workshops of these sacred craftsmen. Let us breathe the heat of their forges. Let us watch their careful hands, their moving lips, their eyes that seem to see beyond the metal they are shaping into something older, something that existed before bronze was ever drawn from the earth. In Korea, the art of casting temple bells reached a pinnacle that has never been surpassed. The great bells of the Silla and Goryeo dynasties are considered among the most perfect acoustic instruments ever created. Their tones pure, their resonance lasting for minutes after a single strike, their voices carrying for miles across valleys and mountain slopes. The bell makers of this tradition did not see themselves as craftsmen. They saw themselves as priests of a different order, serving not in temples, but in foundries, their liturgy written in fire and metal rather than in scripture. The preparation for casting a great bell could take years. The master would fast, pray, and purify himself for months before the pour. The metal itself was treated as a living thing, to be coaxed and persuaded rather than forced. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps memory, of a master smith speaking to his apprentice on the eve of a great casting. The apprentice had asked why such elaborate rituals were necessary, why the metal required prayers when physics alone should determine whether the bell would ring true. The master looked at his apprentice with eyes that had seen 50 years of fire. The bell is not a voice, he said. The bell is near. We are not teaching it to speak. We are teaching it to listen. And there is something far away that will one day speak to it. Our task is to make sure the bell is ready to hear. The apprentice did not understand. He would not understand for another 40 years until the night when every bell in the world rang at once, and he stood in a courtyard, listening to a sound that seemed to confirm everything his master had hinted at, and then spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he had heard. There are whispers in the historical record, fragments of letters between bell makers across cultures, preserved only because they were misunderstood as trade correspondence. These letters, when examined closely, reveal something astonishing. Bell makers in different traditions on different continents were in communication with each other, sharing knowledge that they kept hidden from the temples they served. One letter, apparently from a Japanese bell maker to a counterpart in India, speaks of the tone that waits. This phrase appears again and again in the fragments, always referring to something built into the bells themselves, a frequency, a harmonic, a capacity for sound that would remain dormant until called. The bell makers seemed to be deliberately installing this waiting tone, this silent potential, into their creations, but called by what and when? A document from a European monastery, written by a bell maker who had traveled widely and learned from masters in many lands, contains this cryptic passage. We do not make bells to summon the faithful. We make bells to be summoned. Each bell is a promise kept in bronze, a covenant of listening. When the great voice speaks, our bells will answer. This is why we pray as we pour. This is why we weep as we finish. We are giving the metal a word it will only speak once to someone who was not yet born when we began. The sacred geometry hidden in bell design was known only to the masters. Outsiders who examined the bells saw only their external form, the shape, the the decorative elements, but the masters knew that the true design was internal, invisible, a matter of proportions and cavities and thicknesses that could only be calculated through formulas passed down in secret. These formulas were never written down completely in any one place. Each master held a piece of the knowledge, and only by combining their understanding could a bell be created that was truly ready, ready to receive what would come. The inscriptions on temple bells are another mystery. Many of them were in languages that even the temple priests could not read, placed there at the insistence of the bell makers who refused to explain their meaning. Some inscriptions were deliberately obscured, carved into surfaces that would never be seen once the bell was hung. Others were written in scripts that died with the cultures that created them, leaving modern scholars to puzzle over symbols that seem to combine elements from multiple traditions into something wholly new. One inscription, found on a bell in a remote temple in Southeast Asia, was translated only recently. It reads, I have been taught to hear. I have been given ears of bronze and a throat of fire. When the silence speaks, I will answer. When the distance calls, I will ring. I am not a bell. I am a messenger waiting to be sent. The careful balance of metals that gave each bell its voice was perhaps the most closely guarded secret of all. Bell bronze is traditionally an alloy of copper and tin, but the sacred bells contained trace elements that do not appear in ordinary metallurgy, elements that modern analysis has struggled to identify, that seem to belong to no known source. Some researchers have speculated that these elements were meteoric in origin, metal that fell from the skies, carrying with it properties that earthly ore does not possess. This would explain certain anomalies in the bell's acoustic behavior, the way they seem to resonate with frequencies that cannot be reproduced by bells made with ordinary materials. If this is true, then the bell makers were not merely shaping metal, they were incorporating pieces of the cosmos into their creations, building bridges between earth and sky, installing in their bells a capacity for cosmic listening that goes beyond anything we can explain with physics alone. The bells were not just instruments, they were ears, ears turned toward something vast and distant, waiting with the patience of bronze for a sound that would finally complete the purpose for which they were made. What happened to the bell makers after that night? This is perhaps the strangest part of the story. Many of them, upon hearing that the bells had rung, immediately abandoned their craft. They laid down their tools with what witnesses described as profound reverence, as though completing a task that had lasted generations. Some left written notes, brief, enigmatic statements like, "It is done," or "The message was delivered," or "We can rest now." Several bell makers were found dead in their workshops in the days following the ringing. The remarkable thing is that none of them appeared to have suffered. Their faces, according to those who found them, bore expressions of peace, even joy, as though death had come to them not as an ending, but as a welcome, a release from a vigil that had lasted too long. Entire lineages of bell making families simply stopped. The knowledge they carried was not passed on. The secrets they guarded were allowed to die with them. When later generations tried to reconstruct the craft, they found that something essential was missing, something that could not be recovered from the physical bells themselves, something that existed only in the minds of the masters who were now silent. It was as though the bell makers had known all along that their purpose was temporary. They were custodians of a task, not creators of an art. Once the task was complete, once the bells had spoken the word they were made to speak, there was no reason to continue. The craft had fulfilled its destiny. The makers could finally lay down their burden. Let us close this chapter in an empty foundry. The fires have gone cold. The tools lie where they were placed, with careful intention for the last time. Dust is beginning to settle on the molds, the crucibles, the hammers that shaped metal into meaning. There is a silence here, but it is not the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of completion, the silence that follows a prayer that has finally been answered, the silence of a question that no longer needs to be asked. because the answer has come at last. What did they know? These bell makers, who worked in fire and secret, what instructions did they follow? Passed down through how many generations, guiding their hands as they shaped metal into something more than metal? And who told them, finally, to stop? The foundry holds no answers. The molds have forgotten the shapes they once knew. The fire pits remember only the heat, not the purpose it served. But somewhere, in temples that still stand, the bells wait. They have spoken once, they may speak again, and in their bronze hearts, the knowledge of the bell makers lives on, not as words, not as formulas, but as potential, as readiness, as the infinite patience of metal that has learned how to listen. In the monasteries where the bells rang loudest, a peculiar silence took root, not the comfortable silence of contemplation, nor the reverent silence of prayer. This was something different, a silence that seemed to grow from the inside out, spreading through certain individuals like a vine claiming an abandoned wall. These were the monks who would not speak, or perhaps more accurately, the monks who could not speak, not because their voices had been taken, but because speech itself had become impossible after hearing what the bells had said. Their stories, scattered across traditions and continents, form one of the most haunting threads in this tapestry of mystery. And as we follow that thread, we begin to understand that silence, too, can be a kind of testimony, a witness more eloquent than any words could be. Let us begin in a Tibetan monastery, high in the Himalayas, where the air is so thin that every breath is a small act of devotion. On the night of the ringing, 37 monks sat in meditation beneath the great bell of their temple. They had gathered, as they did every night, to practice the disciplines that had been passed down through their lineage for centuries. Disciplines of breath, of attention, of surrender to the vastness that holds all things. When the bell rang, without human hand upon its rope, without any visible cause, the monks did not move. Their practice had trained them for this, to remain still in the presence of the unexpected, to receive whatever came without grasping or fleeing. The sound washed over them like a wave of liquid gold, filling the meditation hall, vibrating in their bones, their teeth, the very stones of the floor beneath them. The sound lasted only a moment, a single stroke, a single voice, and then it faded, leaving behind a silence deeper than any silence the monks had ever experienced, a silence that seemed to have weight, presence, intention. When morning came, and the monks rose from their meditation, 7 of them did not speak. They went about their duties as usual, tending gardens, copying scriptures, preparing meals. But when addressed, they would only smile and place a finger to their lips, not in warning, not in refusal, in what appeared to be a gentle acknowledgement that something had changed, something that made words not forbidden, but simply insufficient. They never spoke again. The accounts are clear on one remarkable point. This was not trauma. The monks who fell silent did not appear damaged, disturbed, or distressed. They continued their lives with evident peace. Some witnesses even described them as radiant, as though lit from within by a joy that had no need for expression. They ate, they slept, they worked alongside their brothers, they participated in rituals where speech was not required. They communicated through gesture, through written notes, through a kind of presence that seemed to speak louder than any voice. When asked directly about the bell, about what they had heard, about why they no longer spoke, they would only place that finger to their lips and smile. It was not the smile of someone keeping a secret. It was the smile of someone who has found something so complete that sharing it would only diminish it, like trying to pour the ocean into a cup. Similar accounts emerge from Christian hermitages, Shinto shrines, Sufi lodges, and temples of traditions whose names have been lost to time. In each case, a small number of those who heard the bell chose silence, not as a vow, not as a discipline, but as a natural response to an experience that had rendered language obsolete. The numbers varied. In some places, only one, in others, a dozen. But the pattern was consistent. Those who fell silent were not the most devout, the most advanced, the most spiritually accomplished. They seemed to be chosen by criteria that no one could understand, criteria that had nothing to do with rank or training or years of practice. It was as though the bell had spoken a word that some could hear and others could not, and those who heard it found that all other words had become echoes, shadows, pale imitations of the one true sound. We follow the thread of these silent witnesses across decades, for many of them lived long lives after the night of the ringing. Some left writings, not explanations, not accounts of what they had heard, but something more oblique, poetry that circled the event without naming it, drawings of bells and stars and open gates, meditations on the nature of sound and silence that seemed to point towards something without ever arriving. One monk, who had been silent for 30 years, left behind a single page found after his death. It read, "The bell spoke the word that undoes all words. I heard my name, not the name I was given, but the name that was spoken before I was born. How can I speak now? Every word I might say has already been said perfectly in that one tone. I am not silent because I cannot speak. I am silent because I have been spoken, and there is nothing left to add." Another, a nun from an Orthodox convent on a Greek island, left instructions that her testimony be read only after her death. It said, "The bell told me something I already knew but had forgotten. It told me who I really am, and that person has no need of words, no need of explanations, no need to convince anyone of anything. I stopped speaking because speaking would have been a lie, pretense that I was still the person who had not yet heard the bell. That person is gone. What remains is only listening." The phenomenon of voluntary silence as a response to the sacred is not unknown in the world's wisdom traditions. Mystics throughout history have spoken of experiences so profound that words cannot contain them and have sometimes chosen to stop speaking rather than betray, through inadequate language, the truth they have touched. But the silence of those who heard the bell was different. It was not a choice made after struggle, after attempting to communicate and finding language wanting. It was immediate, natural, almost inevitable, as though the bell had not just revealed something, but had actually changed something in those who heard it, had reconfigured their relationship to language at a fundamental level. Some theorists have suggested that the bell communicated in a language beyond words, a language of pure vibration, of frequency, of harmonic resonance that bypassed the mind entirely and spoke directly to something deeper. Those who were capable of receiving this communication found that ordinary language had become not just inadequate, but actually incompatible with what they now knew. It was not that they had nothing to say, it was that what they had to say could only be said in silence. Their very presence became their testimony, their peace became their teaching, their smile, that gentle finger to the lips, came a transmission more powerful than any sermon or scripture. Let us close this chapter in a mountain hermitage where an aged monk sits by a window, watching snow fall past the glass. He has not spoken in 60 years. The monastery around him has changed. New buildings, new monks, new routines. But he remains constant, a living link to the night when the bells rang. And everything changed. The younger monks come to him sometimes, sitting in his presence, hoping perhaps that some of what he carries will transfer to them without words. And perhaps it does. They speak of feeling calmer after sitting with him, clearer, more present to the moment. They say his silence is not empty, but full, full of something they cannot name, but can feel, something that hums at the edge of perception, like a bell that has just stopped ringing. Outside, the snow continues to fall. Inside, the old monk breathes slowly, his face luminous, with a secret that asks nothing and offers everything. He does not need to speak. He does not need to explain. He has become, in his silence, a kind of bell himself, resonating with something that was spoken once and is still speaking for those who have learned how to listen. The finger to the lips, the gentle smile, the eyes that hold a joy beyond understanding. This is the testimony of those who heard the bell and chose to answer its call with the only response adequate to its message: silence. A silence that speaks louder than any word. A silence that is still speaking now. Documentation of the night exists in fragments, and the fragmentation itself tells a story, not a story of loss through accident or neglect, but a story of deliberate, systematic destruction that began almost immediately after the bells fell silent, as though the very act of recording what had happened was a kind of trespass, a violation of something that wished to remain unwritten. This chapter unravels the mystery of why records of the event are so scarce, not through the usual forces of time and decay, but through the conscious choice of those who knew what had happened to ensure that no one else would ever know in full. The burning of the manuscripts is perhaps the strangest chapter in this strange tale, for it was not done by enemies of faith, by conquerors seeking to erase a culture, by anyone who wished to suppress the truth. It was done by the faithful themselves, by monks, priests, and scribes who had spent their lives preserving knowledge, and who now, for reasons they could barely articulate, felt compelled to unmake what they had made. Let us open in a Byzantine scriptorium in the gray light of early morning, where a monk kneels before a small fire. His name has not survived, but his actions were witnessed. Novice, who recorded the scene years later in a private journal that escaped the very purge it described. The monk is weeping, not in distress, but with a kind of tender sorrow, as one might weep when saying goodbye to a beloved friend who is departing on a journey from which they will not return. In his hands, he holds a sheaf of parchments, freshly written, the ink still dark, and one by one, with reverent slowness, he feeds them to the flames. The novice, watching from the doorway, asks why. Why destroy what you have just created? Why unmake the very record you spent the night composing? The monk turns. His face, the novice would later write, was peaceful as a summer lake, yet terrible as a winter storm. He says only, some things must remain unwritten, and then he turns back to the fire and continues feeding the words to the flames, whispering apologies to the parchment as though it were alive, as though it could feel the loss of its own existence. Across the world, in temple archives and monastery libraries, the same scene repeated. Scribes who had dutifully recorded the events of the night, as they recorded all events as their training demanded, found themselves, in the days that followed, returning to their manuscripts with fire in their hands. The remarkable thing is that there was no coordination, no central authority sent instructions, no religious leader issued a decree. The scribes acted independently, separated by vast distances, following an impulse that they could not explain but could not resist. It was as though the act of writing had been a necessary first step, a way of processing, of understanding, of honoring what had occurred. But once the writing was complete, it became clear that the writing itself was a betrayal, not of secrecy, not of any prohibition, but of the event itself, which existed in a realm that language could not enter without diminishing. One Zen chronicle records a master asking his students on the morning after the bell rang to write down what they had heard. The students complied, filling pages with descriptions, interpretations, philosophical reflections. The master collected their writings, read them carefully, nodded, and then immediately burned them all. The bell did not ring to become a sentence, he said. It rang to become silence. Your words have honored the silence by attempting to capture it. No, let the silence reclaim what belongs to it. The few documents that survived did so only by accident or oversight, hidden in collections so obscure that the burning hands never found them. buried in the margins of unrelated manuscripts, overlooked by those who were searching for direct accounts, passed down orally for generations before being written down by someone who did not know the prohibition or who chose to defy it. These fragments speak around the event rather than about it. They use metaphors so dense they read like poetry. The gate that opens once, the word that unwords, the light that casts no shadow because it is the shadow. They hint at meaning without stating it, point toward truth without grasping it, create a kind of negative space in which the reader can feel the shape of what has been deliberately left out. One fragment, found in a collection of astronomical observations where it clearly did not belong, reads, "On this night I heard my own death calling to me and found it beautiful. I heard the end of all things and found it the beginning. I heard silence speak and have not been able to hear words the same way since. I write this knowing I will burn it. I burn it knowing it must be written. The paradox is the message. Another, preserved only because it was mistaken for a shopping list and tucked into a merchant's ledger, contains this. The bell returned something to its home. We were all witnesses to a departure. What left will come back. When it does, we will remember what we have forgotten we knew. Until then, silence is the only appropriate speech. The philosophy of sacred silence runs deep in many wisdom traditions. The idea that certain truths cannot be spoken, only experienced. That words create distance between the knower and the known. That the highest realization is one that dissolves the very self that might speak of it. The scribes who burned their manuscripts were not simply following orders or obeying prohibitions. They were enacting a philosophy, a recognition that the event they had witnessed belonged to a category of experience that language could only diminish. By attempting to write it, they had committed a kind of loving violence against it. By burning what they wrote, they were restoring its wholeness. This is why we cannot reconstruct what happened that night from documents alone. The documents were destroyed not to hide the truth, but to protect it, to keep it safe from the inevitable distortions of language, the reductions of description, the freezing of living mystery into dead fact. What we have, instead, are the spaces where documents should be, gaps in archives, missing pages in otherwise complete chronicles, indices that list titles of manuscripts that no longer exist, their contents unknown except by their names. On the night of the single sound, the voice that needed no throat, what the bells remembered. These absences speak as loudly as any text. They tell us that something happened, something so significant that those who knew it best chose to leave no record, something so sacred that even the faithful preferred forgetting to the violence of inadequate remembrance. Let us close this chapter with an image, an empty archive shelf, somewhere in a monastery library that still stands. The shelf once held a collection of manuscripts about that night, a complete account perhaps, or as complete as any account could be. The catalog tells us they existed. The catalog tells us their titles, but the shelf is empty. Dust motes float in the candlelight. The wood of the shelf has been polished by centuries of hands reaching for books that are no longer there. And in that emptiness, something waits. Not the books themselves, which are gone, but the silence that the books were sacrificed to protect. For perhaps this is the true lesson of the burning manuscripts, that some things exist more fully in their absence than they ever could in their presence. That the gap in the record is not a loss, but a gift, a space into which we can place our own listening, our own silence, our own willingness to encounter mystery without demanding that it explain itself. What was written and then burned, we will never know. Not everyone that night was inside a sacred space. There were those who walked between, pilgrims on mountain paths, merchants crossing holy valleys, wanderers who happened to be suspended in the liminal spaces when the bells began to ring. These travelers heard something different from those who stood beneath the bells. They heard not a single voice, but a convergence, sounds arriving from multiple directions, meeting in the space where they walked, creating harmonies that no single bell could produce. Their accounts, scattered and often dismissed, suggest that the message of the bells was not just for those who had arrived at sacred destinations. It was also, perhaps especially, for those who were still on the way, for those who had not yet found what they were seeking, for those who existed in that moment in the pure state of journeying itself. Let us begin with a Japanese poet walking the old Tokaido Road at night. The great temple he had visited lies behind him now, its massive bell silent in his memory. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, waits a small shrine where he hopes to arrive by morning. He is suspended between no longer at the place he left, not yet at the place he seeks. The night is still around him. His footsteps on the packed earth are the only sound. The moon has not yet risen, and he walks by starlight, following the road more by memory than by sight. And then the bells begin. He stops, frozen, mid-step. From behind him, the deep voice of the great temple's bell. From ahead, the lighter tone of the shrine he is approaching, and from directions he cannot identify. East, west, from the mountains, from the valleys, other bells, other voices, each distinct, yet somehow blending into a single, vast chord that seems to fill not just the air, but the space inside his chest. His travel journal, preserved only because it was dismissed for centuries as metaphorical fancy, describes what he experienced. The sounds met in the space where I stood. They did not collide. They merged. They became something that neither bell could speak alone. And I understood in that moment that I belonged neither to the temple behind nor the shrine ahead. I belonged to the road itself. The bells were speaking directly to the journey, to everyone suspended in the act of seeking. Similar accounts emerge from travelers across the world. A Christian pilgrim pausing on a ridge in northern Spain hearing bells from 3 villages in the valley below ring simultaneously, their tones weaving together as they rose toward him. He writes of feeling that he was standing at the center of a great wheel, with the bells as spokes, all converging where he stood, a Buddhist wanderer on the Silk Road, camping in a narrow pass between mountain ranges, who heard the sound arriving not just from temples he knew, but from directions where no temple could possibly exist. He described it as hearing the bells of the future and the bells of the past, all ringing together in the present moment. A merchant's wife in North Africa, traveling with her husband's caravan through the desert, who stepped away from the camp to relieve herself and found herself suddenly surrounded by sound, bells from oases they had passed days ago, bells from cities they would not reach for weeks, bells she would never identify, all singing together in the cold desert night. She said later that she felt for just a moment as though every journey she had ever taken and would ever take had become visible to her all at once. A great web of paths crossing and connecting, and she standing at one of the infinite points where they met. The spiritual significance of liminal space, the threshold, the crossroads, the journey itself, is recognized in many traditions. These are places of power, of danger, of transformation. They are places where the ordinary rules of reality grow thin, where encounters with the extraordinary become possible. The traveler is neither here nor there. The traveler belongs to the road, which belongs to no one and everyone. In this state of belonging nowhere, the traveler is open in ways that the settled cannot be, open to messages that require emptiness and to receive, open to sounds that need silence to be heard. Perhaps this is why the bells spoke differently to those between temples than to those within them. The monks and priests heard a single voice, the voice of their own bell, their own tradition, their own path. But the travelers heard the convergence, the place where all paths meet, where all traditions pour their wisdom into a single river, where the differences between religions and philosophies dissolve into something older and simpler. The travelers heard the road speaking, and the road, that night, had something to say. What did the road say? The Japanese poet, in the only direct statement any of these travelers left about the meaning of what they heard, wrote, "The bell said, the seeking is the finding, the walking is the arriving, the journey is the destination, and has been, all along." He continued walking after the bells fell silent. He reached the small shrine by morning, as he had planned. He spent the day there in prayer, as custom required. But his journal records that his prayers felt different after that night, not requests sent outward toward a distant God, but conversations with something that was already present, already listening, already walking beside him on every road he would ever travel. "I used to pray for arrival," he wrote. "Now I pray in gratitude for the road itself, the road that is always beneath my feet, the road that carries me not toward the sacred, but through it." For the sacred, I now understand, is not a place, it is the traveling. Let us close this chapter on a moonlit road, stretching between darkness and darkness. A traveler walks, their destination unknown to us, their journey part of the great web of journeys that covers the earth. The bells have fallen silent, but their echo remains in the traveler's step, in their breath, in the quiet certainty that the road itself is holy ground. To be between temples is not to be without the sacred, it is to be within the sacred that holds all temples, all shrines, all the destinations that humans have ever sought or will ever seek. It is to be inside the journey itself, which has no beginning and no end, only the eternal present of one foot following another, one breath following another, one moment of living attention following other into the infinite. The bells spoke to those who had arrived, but they also spoke to those who were still traveling, and to them, perhaps, the message was clearest of all. You are already home. The road is the temple. Keep walking. Among all the witnesses to the night of the bells, children remembered in ways that troubled and fascinated their elders. Too young for doctrine, too innocent for interpretation, but old enough to carry the sound into their long lives. These small witnesses offer a window into the event that no adult account can provide. For children do not hear as adults hear. They do not filter. They do not interpret. They receive what comes to them whole, undivided by the categories that adults use to make sense of the world. And what they received that night stayed with them in forms that defy ordinary explanation. This chapter enters the world of those who were young when the bells rang, and follows the thread of their memories across the years into the lives they built and the people they became. Let us begin in a small village in Russia, where a girl of 5 years was awakened by the church bell ringing in the deep of night. She climbed out of her bed, padding on bare feet to the window, and looked out at the church across the square. There was no one there. The bell swung once, twice, and fell still. In the morning, her mother asked if she had heard the bell. The girl nodded solemnly. What did it say? Her mother asked, perhaps expecting confusion or fear. The girl thought for a moment, her small face serious with concentration. Then she said, It said, come home, but not to anyone here. Her mother felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning. She asked the girl what she meant. The girl could not explain further. She only knew, with the certainty that children sometimes have, that the bell had been calling to someone, but not to anyone in the village, not to anyone the girl knew. It was calling to something else, something far away, something that had been away for a very long time and was finally being welcomed back. Children's accounts from that night, scattered across cultures, share strange consistencies that the children themselves could not have manufactured. They describe the sound as having color, invariably gold or silver, or the color of very old light. They speak of the bell's voice as containing images, pictures that appeared briefly behind their closed eyes and then vanished. A boy in Egypt asked what he saw when the bell rang, described a gate opening, not a specific gate. He could not say where it led or what was on the other side, just a gate, vast and golden, swinging slowly inward to reveal light that had no source. A girl in Japan saw a figure turning around, not a person she recognized, just a figure seen from behind, suddenly turning to face her. She said she woke up before she could see the face, but she knew somehow that the face would have been kind. A child in the mountains of Tibet described a garden where the flowers were actually sleeping people. They were dreaming themselves into being flowers, he said, and the bell was waking them up very gently so they wouldn't be frightened. A Japanese boy asked what the bell sounded like, gave perhaps the most enigmatic description of all. It remembered something and then forgot it again. And a child in North Africa, whose account was preserved by accident in a merchant's trade log, said simply, "The bell was trying not to cry." These accounts were largely dismissed as childish imagination. Children, after all, are known for their fanciful interpretations, their inability to distinguish between inner experience and outer reality. The adults who heard these descriptions nodded politely and returned to their own concerns, filing the children's memories under the category of dreams and make believe. But perhaps we should consider them differently. Perhaps we should treat them not as imaginative distortions, but as a different kind of evidence, unfiltered perception, unburdened by the need to make the experience acceptable to adult minds. For children, hear what adults have learned not to hear. They see what adults have learned not to see. They receive the world before it has been processed, categorized, explained away. What if the children that night received something that the adults' conditioning had made them deaf to? What if the images of gates and gardens and turning figures were not fantasies, but perceptions, glimpses of dimensions that the adult mind automatically filters out? The bell spoke. The children heard, and what they heard was not just sound, but vision, not just tone, but color, not just message, but image. They heard the bell with their whole being, receiving it into parts of themselves that adults have long since closed off. We follow some of these children into their later years, tracing the faint threads of their lives through history's vastness. Many of them became artists, painters, musicians, poets, though none achieved fame. Their work, when it survives at all, tends toward the abstract, the suggestive, the not quite said, images of light breaking through darkness, melodies that seem to be reaching for a note that doesn't exist in any scale, poems that circle meaning without landing on it. Others became mystics or contemplatives, drawn to practices of silence and attention. Still others lived entirely ordinary lives, farmers, merchants, mothers and fathers, but with a quality of presence that those who knew them remarked upon, a certain stillness, a certain listening. as though they were always half attending to something that others couldn't hear. None became famous. All seemed content with obscurity. It was as though what they had received that night had satisfied something so deep that worldly achievement became unnecessary, even slightly absurd. Why chase recognition when you have already been recognized? Why seek meaning when meaning has already found you? Let us close this chapter with an elderly woman sitting in a garden in the last years of her life. She was 5 years old on the night of the bells. Now she is 93, and the world has changed so completely around her that she sometimes feels like a visitor from another age. A young scholar has come to interview her, having heard rumors that she remembers the night. He asks her carefully, respectfully, what she recalls of the event that history has mostly forgotten. She is quiet for a long time. The garden is quiet around her. Birds sing in the trees. Somewhere a child is laughing. Finally, she speaks. I heard the bell tell me not to worry, she says. Her voice is soft, cracked with age, but clear. It told me that everything was going to be all right, not just for me, for everyone, for everything. The scholar waits, sensing there is more. I have spent my whole life trying to remember how not to worry, she says. The bell knew how. It tried to teach me, and sometimes, in very quiet moments, I almost remember what it said. She looks up at the sky, at the light filtering through the leaves, at the world that has carried her for nearly a century. Almost, she says again, almost. And she smiles, the smile of a child who heard something wonderful once and has been living in its echo ever since. What do children hear that adults have learned not to hear? And what would we remember if we could listen as they listen? In the morning after the ringing, many bells bore marks of their mysterious sounding. Hairline fractures appeared in bronze that had been flawless for centuries. Tones shifted, some bells higher, some lower, some producing harmonics that had never been there before. Subtle warping, invisible to the eye, but audible to the trained ear, changed the voices of instruments that had been considered perfect. This chapter explores what happened to these changed bells, the decisions to repair, recast, or retire them, and the strange reluctance that surrounded each choice. For in the marks the bells bore, some saw damage, and some saw revelation. In a Thai temple, on the banks of a slow river, the great bronze bell had hung for 400 years without blemish. Generations of monks had struck it, had heard its voice call them to prayer, had felt its vibration settle into their bones. It was a sacred object, yes, but also a familiar one, part of the temple's daily rhythm, as constant as the sunrise. After the night of the ringing, a crack was discovered running through the bell's surface. Not a large crack, a hairline, visible only when the light struck at certain angles, but it ran through an inscription that had been illegible for generations, worn smooth by weather and time, and the touch of countless hands. The crack made the words visible. The monks gathered around, straining to read the ancient script that had been hidden for so long. The translation, when it was finally achieved, read, "When the silent call comes, answer." These words, cast into the bell by its unknown maker centuries ago, had been waiting for this crack to reveal their purpose. The inscription was a command, and the bell had obeyed it. Similar discoveries occurred in temples across the world. Fractures that revealed hidden texts, damage that uncovered secrets. It was as though the bells had been designed with messages that would only become legible when the stress of their true purpose finally activated them. A bell in Korea cracked in a pattern that formed a symbol, a character that exists in no known language, but that priests who saw it independently described as meaning something like fulfilled or completed. A bell in Greece split along a line that exposed a cavity inside the bronze, a deliberate, hollow space that had been sealed within the metal during casting, containing nothing, an empty chamber, a space for something that wasn't there. Some temple keepers saw these damaged bells as more sacred than they had been when whole. The cracks were stigmata, wounds received in the service of the divine. They refused to repair what the night had touched, preferring to preserve the marks as testimony, as memory, as proof that something had happened, even if no one could say exactly what. Others, however, chose differently, disturbed by the changes, concerned about what the cracked bells might mean. They ordered them melted down and recast. They wanted fresh metal, pure metal, metal that carried no memory of that strange night. They would find that this was not possible. The bells that were recast carried something of the original voice. The metal, though melted and reformed, retained harmonic properties that no metallurgist could explain. The new bells sounded almost like the old ones, but not quite. There was something else in their voice now, a faint overtone, an echo that seemed to come from very far away. Several temples reported hearing strange sounds from their recast bells during certain phases of the moon. Not the bells being struck, they hung motionless, untouched, but from somewhere within the bronze, a humming, a vibration, as though the metal was remembering the sound it had made and trying, very softly, to make it again. One monastery in China recast their bell 3 times, trying to remove the anomaly. Each time, the new bell carried the same strange resonance. On the fourth attempt, they gave up. They accepted that whatever had entered their metal on the night of the ringing could not be melted out. It had become part of the bronze itself, as fundamental as copper and tin. The monks learned to live with it. Some even came to treasure it, the faint echo of that impossible night, preserved in metal, whispering just below the threshold of ordinary hearing. Can holiness be transferred? Can sacredness be broken, reformed, redistributed? Can the touch of the divine, once received, ever be removed? These questions haunted the temple keepers who struggled with what to do about their changed bells. Some traditions taught that sacred objects could be destroyed, their holiness released back into the divine source from which it came. Others held that once something had been touched by the sacred, it was forever marked, forever different, forever carrying that touch into whatever form it might later take. The bells seemed to confirm the second view. Whatever they had become on the night of the ringing, they remained. The metal remembered. The bronze had learned something and could not unlearn it. Perhaps this should not surprise us. We speak of matter as though it is dead, inert, without memory or awareness. But the mystics of many traditions teach otherwise. They speak of the consciousness that pervades all things, the awareness that sleeps in stone and dreams in metal, the life that pulses through everything that exists. If this is true, if matter itself is a form of mind, then why should we be surprised that metal can learn, that bronze can remember, that a bell, once touched by something vast and sacred, might carry that touch forever in its molecular structure, in the arrangement of its atoms, in the pattern of its vibrations? Let us close this chapter with an artisan working in a small shop in the countryside, examining a fragment of an original bell. It was given to him by a temple that recast their bell long ago, a chip of the original bronze, preserved as a relic, passed down through generations of keepers. He holds the fragment to his ear. It is a small piece, no larger than his thumb. It cannot ring. It cannot sound. It is just a chip of metal, cold and silent. And yet, he swears he can hear something, a vibration so faint it might be his own pulse, a hum so quiet it might be the blood singing in his ear, a tone so subtle it might be imagination or memory or hope, or it might be the bell, still ringing, still speaking, still carrying in its broken fragment the voice it spoke once, long ago, when all the bells of the world rang together and the boundaries between heaven and earth grew thin as mist. He sets the fragment down carefully, reverently, as though handling something alive. And perhaps he is. Perhaps in that small piece of bronze, the night of the bells is still happening. Perhaps the sound has never stopped. Perhaps it is still resonating, too quiet for ordinary ears, too subtle for ordinary attention, but present, always present, waiting for those who know how to listen to what metal remembers. After the bells had rung and the world resumed its ordinary rhythms, something lingered in the temples, not a sound, the opposite of sound, a quality of silence that had not been there before, that seemed to have settled into the stones and rafters like incense settling into cloth. This chapter explores that residue, that aftermath, the strange gift that the bells left behind when their single note faded into stillness. For the sound may have passed, but something else took its place, something that visitors to these temples even today, sometimes feel when they enter their hallowed spaces. In a mountain monastery in Greece, the monks report that their bell tower carries a particular stillness that visitors often describe as listening, not silent in the ordinary way. There is always some sound in the world, always wind or birds or distant footsteps. But beneath these sounds, underneath them, there is a quality of quiet attention that seems to pervade the space itself. Visitors who enter the tower for the first time often pause mid-step, feeling something they cannot name. Many describe a sense of being heard, not watched, not judged, but heard in a way that has nothing to do with spoken words, as though the tower itself is paying attention to them, receiving their presence the way a host receives a long awaited guest. The monks who live with this phenomenon daily describe it simply. The bell taught the tower how to listen. When the bell spoke, the tower learned. Now the tower listens all the time, whether the bell is ringing or not. This phenomenon appears across traditions, in temples and shrines, and sacred spaces around the world. A Japanese temple known for its garden of raked sand reports that the patterns hold silence differently since the night of the bells. Sound moves across the garden more slowly, visitors say, as though passing through something invisible, something that offers gentle resistance to vibration. A Tibetan monastery describes their meditation hall as having become deeper after that night. The space feels larger than its physical dimensions would suggest. Meditators report dropping into stillness more quickly, more completely, as though the room itself assists their practice, pulling them gently into depths that would normally take years to reach. A Sufi lodge in the Middle East reports that their prayer space has developed what they call acoustic compassion, a quality that seems to soften harsh sounds, to transform angry voices, to invite whispers rather than shouts. People who enter into conflict often leave in peace without knowing exactly what changed them. It is as though the bells, by speaking once with such power, changed the nature of the silence that followed. They did not merely produce sound and leave emptiness in its wake. They produced a new kind of silence, a silence that is not absence, but presence, not void, but fullness, not empty, but overflowing with something that our ordinary senses cannot quite grasp. The metaphysics of sacred silence has been explored by mystics throughout history. They speak of silence as the ground from which all sound arises and to which all sound returns. They describe meditation as the practice of entering that ground, of sinking beneath the noise of thought into the stillness that underlies all mental activity. They teach that in this silence, something can be found that words can never capture, a presence, a knowing, an experience of connection that transcends the boundaries of the self. What if the bells that night spoke from that ground? What if their sound originated not in the physical vibration of metal, but in the deeper silence that metal, properly shaped and consecrated, can access? And what if, in speaking from that silence, they opened a doorway through which some of that silence could flow into our world and remain? The spaces where the bells rang would then be spaces where that doorway is still slightly ajar, not fully open. The bells spoke only once and briefly, but not fully closed either. A crack remains, a passage through which the deeper silence seeps, century after century, filling the temple with its subtle presence. This is why pilgrims to these places feel what they feel. This is why visitors pause mid-step, touched by something they cannot name. They are sensing the silence that came through the doorway the bells opened. They are standing in the presence of a quiet that is older than the universe, deeper than time, wider than space. Some say this silence can be heard by those who know how to listen, not heard as sound is heard, but received as presence is received, felt as attention is felt. It is a listening silence, a silence that is itself listening, that receives whatever is offered to it with perfect acceptance and infinite patience. Visitors to these temples often report feeling that they are not alone, that something is with them in the empty space, not a ghost, not a spirit in the traditional sense, something larger, something that does not speak but communicates anyway through pressure and temperature and the subtle shift of awareness that comes when you realize you are being attended to. Perhaps the bells left behind not just a different quality of silence, but a different kind of presence. Perhaps what remains in these temples is the attention of whatever spoke through the bells that night, still turned toward us, still waiting, still listening for our response to the message it sent so long ago. Let us close this chapter in a chapel at dusk, in a monastery that has stood for 1,000 years. The light is fading, the walls are cool stone, unadorned except for a single icon in the corner. The bell hangs silent in its tower, outside, waiting for the next hour's call. A visitor sits in the quiet. She has come from far away, drawn by stories she half believed, seeking something she cannot quite name. She is not a religious person in any traditional sense. She does not pray. She does not belong to any faith. But as she sits in the silence, she feels something shifting inside her, the noise of her mind, the constant chatter that usually fills her head, begins to settle like sediment in still water. Beneath it, she senses something else, a vastness, a depth, a presence that seems to extend in all directions, including directions she didn't know existed. She is not alone. She realizes this with a certainty that surprises her. Something is here in the empty chapel, not watching her. That would imply distance, separation. It is simply here as she is here, sharing the same space, breathing the same silence. She does not move. She does not want to disturb whatever this is. She sits and breathes and lets the silence hold her, and the silence holds her, patient, eternal, aware, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for whoever might come seeking stillness. What listens in the silence the bells left behind, and what is it waiting to hear? While the temples fell into their strange new silence, a different kind of witness was recording the night sky. Astronomers, stargazers, keepers of celestial records, these patient observers would realize only years later that the night of the bells coincided with events in the heavens that should have been impossible. This chapter turns upward, away from the temple and their earthbound mysteries, toward the stars that may hold the key to understanding what happened, or may only deepen the mystery beyond all hope of resolution. Let us begin with an Arab astronomer working in an observatory that stood like a sentinel on a hill overlooking the desert. He was meticulous in his records, as his predecessor had been for generations before him. Every night, clear or cloudy, he noted the positions of the stars, the phases of the moon, the movements of the planets. His charts were works of art, precision and beauty combined in service of understanding the heavens. Years after the night of the bells, he was reviewing his old observations when he noticed something strange. On that night, a night he had recorded as unremarkable, the sky clear, the stars in their expected places, a star that should have been invisible had crossed into visibility for a brief time. It was a faint star, one he had never seen before or since. It appeared, according to his careful notations, for exactly the duration of a bell's ring, a single sustained tone, and then vanished from observation. He searched his records for any other mention of this star. There was none. He searched the records of other astronomers, seeking correspondence, seeking confirmation. He found nothing. The star had appeared once, for one night, for one brief moment, and then had not been seen again for 300 years. When it did reappear, in a different century, in a different observer's chart, it was noted with a question mark. The observer did not know what to make of it. It was there, and then it was gone. A ghost star, a wanderer between visibilities. Similar anomalies emerge from the astronomical records of that night, scattered across the observatories of the ancient world. A Chinese court astronomer recorded a comet that changed direction without explanation. Comets follow predictable paths, their tails always pointing away from the sun. This comet, according to his meticulous notes, curved. It bent its trajectory as though responding to some force that did not exist in any known physics, and then it returned to its original course, as though the deviation had never happened. An Indian astronomer noted that certain planetary positions that night did not match his calculations. He checked his mathematics, checked his instruments, checked his assumptions. Everything was correct. The planets for that one night were simply not where they should have been. By morning, they had returned to their expected positions, and he could only note the anomaly and move on. In the astronomical records of the Maya, a civilization that tracked the heavens with obsessive precision, there is a gap on that night, a blank space where observations should have been recorded. No explanation is given. The astronomers simply stopped. And then, the next night, they resumed, as though nothing had happened, or as though whatever had happened was not to be written down. These anomalies are subtle. They are easily dismissed. A star that appears briefly could be a recording error. A comet that changes direction could be a misremembered observation. Planetary positions that don't match calculations could indicate a flaw in the mathematics of the era. But taken together, examined by patient scholars over centuries, they suggest something that no astronomer would dare say directly, that the Night of the Bells was not merely a terrestrial event, that whatever summoned the bells to ring was not merely local to the Earth, that the sky itself responded, or perhaps participated, in something that touched both heaven and earth at once. There are ancient traditions that link bells to cosmic order. The Chinese believed that certain tones could influence celestial movements, that properly constructed instruments could resonate with the music of the spheres and call down blessings from above. The Greeks spoke of the harmony of the heavens, a music produced by the movement of the stars that mortal ears could not hear, but that bronze, properly shaped, could capture and reflect. What if these were not just myths? What if the bells were designed, from the beginning, to be instruments of cosmic communication, sending and receiving across distances that have nothing to do with miles? What if the Night of the Bells was not just a ringing heard on earth, but a ringing heard throughout the universe, a signal sent outward or received from beyond? The slow work of scholars across centuries has assembled these anomalies into a pattern that points towards something none dare name directly. The stars shifted, the planets moved. Something appeared in the sky that should not have been visible, and something changed in the paths of heavenly bodies that should have been fixed. It is as though the sky itself paused to listen when the bells rang, as though the cosmos, that vast machinery of light and gravity, held its breath for one moment along with the earth, as though the boundaries between terrestrial and celestial, between the temple and the stars, dissolved just long enough for something to pass between them. The bells did not ring in response to something happening in the sky. The sky responded to the bells. The entire cosmos, for one impossible moment, leaned in to hear what the temples had to say. Let us close this chapter with an astronomer standing on a rooftop long after the night has passed, gazing up at stars that keep their own counsel. She has read the old records. She has traced the anomalies. She understands, as few do, that something happened that night that her science cannot explain. She does not know what the bells said. She does not know who or what was listening. She knows only that for one moment the barrier between earth and heaven became permeable, and something passed through in both directions. She wonders as she watches the stars wheel slowly overhead if they are still waiting, if the message sent that night is still traveling outward, crossing light years, approaching destinations unimaginably distant, if somewhere, somewhen, another civilization might receive what the bells transmitted, and wonder, as she wonders now, who sent it and why. Or perhaps the message was not sent outward at all. Perhaps it was received from beyond, and the bells were merely the instruments through which the cosmos spoke to a small planet that had finally, after millennia of waiting, learned how to listen. She cannot know. She will never know. But she watches the stars anyway, as her predecessors watched, as her successors will watch, knowing that the ski holds secrets that will never be fully revealed, and finding in that not knowing a strange and lasting peace. Are the stars still waiting for the bells to speak again? Or have they already answered in a language we have not yet learned to hear? In the weeks after the night of the bells, a peculiar phenomenon spread through the sleeping world. People who had never visited temples, who had perhaps never heard any bell ring at all, began to dream of bells, similar bells, ringing similar tones, in dreams so vivid that they woke with the taste of bronze in their mouths. This chapter enters the intimate world of these dreamers, following the trace of a sound that seemed to continue its journey not through air or space, but through the mysterious territory of human sleep. Let us begin with a farmer in medieval England, a man who had never left his village, who had never seen a temple bell larger than the modest bronze that hung in his local church. He was a practical man, his dreams usually filled with the concerns of his waking life, weather, crops, the health of his animals. But one night, in the weeks following the event that he knew nothing about, he dreamed of a bell, not the bell of his village church, something vastly larger, vastly older, suspended in a sky that had no ground beneath it. The bell was golden, or perhaps made of light that resembled gold. It hung in emptiness, and he stood before it, or floated before it, feeling no fear, only a vast and peaceful curiosity. The bell rang, not through the air of the dream, there was no air, but through him, through his bones, his heart, his mind. He felt himself vibrating with the tone, becoming part of it, dissolving into a sound that was also somehow a meaning, a message, a word that he almost understood but could not quite grasp. He woke with tears on his face, not knowing why he was crying, and in the days that followed, he found himself carving something into the beam of his barn, a shape he did not consciously recognize, a design that his hands seemed to know even though his mind did not. 500 years later, a researcher would recognize that carving as identical to a temple bell in distant Japan, a bell the farmer could never have seen in a land he did not know existed. Similar accounts emerge from sleepers across the world in the weeks and months following the night of the bells, a shared dream image that crossed all boundaries of culture and geography. People who had no connection to each other, no shared heritage, no common religious background, all dreaming variations of the same scene. A bell suspended in vastness, ringing with a sound that was felt rather than heard. The details varied. Some saw the bell against a backdrop of stars. Some saw it in a garden that seemed to stretch to infinity. Some saw it in a room with walls of light. But the bell itself was remarkably consistent, large, ancient, somehow alive with presence and purpose. And the sound, always the sound, a tone that communicated meaning without words, that conveyed something crucial and sacred that the dreamers woke straining to remember, grasping at a message that receded like starlight each time consciousness returned. Many dreamers reported that the bell was trying to tell them something they almost understood, a truth at the edge of comprehension, a word that would make everything clear if they could only hold on to it. But they couldn't. They woke, and the word dissolved, leaving only the memory of having almost known something infinite. How do we explain this phenomenon? How did the sound of the bells, rung in temples that these dreamers had never visited, in lands they had never seen, reach them through sleep? Some have proposed theories of collective unconscious, the idea that all human minds are connected at a level beneath ordinary awareness, and that certain experiences, if powerful enough, can ripple through that shared space like waves through water. The bells, in this theory, rang so loudly in the collective psyche that their echo reached even those who did not hear them with physical ears. Others have suggested that sound itself can travel through realms beyond physical hearing. That vibration, at certain frequencies, can propagate not just through air and stone, but through dimensions we visit only in sleep. The dreamers, in this view, were not imagining bells, they were hearing them with the deeper ears that open only when the waking mind is still. And still others have proposed that the bell itself is not merely a physical object, but an archetype, a shape in the collective human soul that represents connection between heaven and earth, between the human and the divine. When the physical bells rang that night, they awakened their archetypal counterpart, which then appeared in dreams around the world as the sleeping mind's way of processing an experience too vast for waking consciousness to contain. Whatever the explanation, the dreams had lasting effects. Many dreamers reported changes in their lives afterward, subtle shifts in perception, in priority, in the way they understood their place in the world. They became quieter, more attentive, more present to ordinary moments. They lost interest in pursuits that had previously consumed them. They found themselves drawn to silence, to contemplation, to the kind of still attention that temples are designed to cultivate. Some became artists, trying to capture what they had glimpsed. Some became healers, moved by a compassion that had awakened in the bell's tone. Some simply lived their ordinary lives with an extraordinary quality of presence, touching everyone they met with a peace they could not explain but could somehow transmit. It was as though the dream had planted something in them, a seed that grew slowly over years, changing them from the inside in ways they often didn't recognize until much later. The bell had spoken, and even those who received its message only in sleep were transformed by what they received. Let us close this chapter with an image of the sleeping world wrapped in an invisible tone that continues to propagate through the dimension of dreams. The bells rang once, long ago, in temples scattered across the earth, but in the realm of sleep, they are still ringing. Every night, somewhere, someone dreams of a golden bell suspended in vastness. Every night, someone wakes with tears they cannot explain, reaching for a message that dissolves like mist in morning light. The bell is still ringing in the place where dreams are born, and every sleeper, whether they remember or not, has heard it at least once. Close your eyes tonight. Listen with the ears that open only in darkness. Perhaps you too will hear it. The sound that has never stopped. The word that waits at the edge of remembering. The bell that rings in the space between waking and sleep, calling you towards something you have always known but have never quite been able to name. Is the bell still ringing somewhere we can only reach when we close our eyes? And what would we remember if we could bring its message back with us into waking? Here, at the end of our journey, we must speak of what was never spoken, the possibility that the night of the bells was not a conclusion, but a beginning, not an ending, but an opening, not a message complete in itself, but the first word of a conversation that has not yet finished. This final chapter gathers the threads of prophecy, the whispered traditions that speak of the bells ringing again, not in an ending, but in a recognition, a moment when the world would finally be ready to hear what the first ringing had tried to say. In a small temple in the mountains of Nepal, far from any road, accessible only by paths that pilgrims have walked for centuries, an old keeper tends a bell that has not been struck since that night. His father tended it before him, and his grandfather before that, and so on back through generations that disappear into the mist of unrecorded time. The bell is not large, perhaps the size of a man's torso. Its bronze has turned green with age, decorated with inscriptions in a language that even the keeper does not understand. It hangs in a small tower of a weathered stone, swaying slightly in the mountain winds, but never ringing, never touched. The keeper's duty is simple: keep the bell clean, keep the rope ready, do not ring it, but do not let it be forgotten. When asked why, he tells a story that his father told him, that his father's father told him, passed down through generations, like water passed hand to hand in the desert. The story says that the bell rang once, long ago, with all the bells of the world. The story says that when it rang, something happened that could not be spoken of. The story says that the bell will ring again, not when humans choose to ring it, but when the time comes, and the keeper's lineage exists to ensure that when that time arrives, the bell is ready. I do not expect it in my lifetime, he said. his weathered face calm. My father did not expect it in his. We do not keep the bell because we think we will hear it. We keep it because someone must. We keep it because the bell asked to be kept. We keep it because this is what our family does and has always done and will always do until the ringing comes again. Similar keepers exist across the world, quiet inheritors of an instruction passed down through generations, maintaining bells that have not been rung in centuries. They do not know each other. They do not coordinate their efforts. They simply keep their bells clean, their ropes ready, their attention on a horizon that may never reveal what they are watching for. In Japan, a family has maintained a temple bell for 40 generations. The temple itself has fallen into ruin and been rebuilt 3 times. But the bell has never moved, never been replaced, never been rung. The family does not discuss their duty with outsiders. They simply do it, as they have always done it, as they will always do it. In Ethiopia, a Christian monastery guards a bell that their traditions say was cast by angels. The bell hangs in a locked tower, visited only by the monastery's abbot, who enters once a year to clean it and pray. He does not pray for the bell to ring. He prays only that he will be worthy, if the ringing comes, to hear it. In a village in Ireland, long after Christianity replaced the old ways, a family still tends a fairy bell that hangs in a grove of ancient oaks. They do not know why they tend it. They only know that their ancestors have always done so, and that something terrible would happen if they stopped, though none can say what. These keepers do not expect the ringing in their lifetimes. They do not expect to understand its meaning when it comes. They exist only to maintain the possibility, to keep the gate oiled, as it were, so that when the time arrives, it will open smoothly. They are guardians not of knowledge, but of readiness, servants not of understanding, but of availability. What do the prophecies say about the second ringing? They are fragmentary, contradictory, often deliberately vague. But certain themes recur, appearing independently in traditions that could not have influenced each other. The first theme is readiness. The bells will ring again. These prophecies say, when humanity is ready to hear what they have to say. The first ringing was a preparation, a kind of tuning, a calibration. It set something in motion that has been developing ever since, slowly, imperceptibly, in the depths of human consciousness. When that development reaches its completion, when humanity has become what it needs to become, the bells will ring again to announce the transformation. The second theme is recognition. The bells will ring, some prophecies say, when something that left long ago finally returns. The first ringing was a farewell, or perhaps a promise. Something departed from the world that night, withdrew behind a veil, began a journey through spaces that have no names. When that journey ends, when whatever left comes home, the bells will ring in welcome. The third theme is awakening. The world, these prophecies suggest, is dreaming. Everything we experience as reality is the dream of something vast and sleeping. The first ringing was a stirring, a moment when the sleeper shifted, when the dream flickered, when those within it glimpsed for an instant the nature of their existence. The second ringing will be the awakening itself. The dream will end. The dreamer will rise. And everything we thought we knew will be transformed by the light of full consciousness. But perhaps the prophecies miss the point. Perhaps the question is not when the bells will ring again, but whether they ever stopped. Consider what we have learned in our journey through this mystery. The bells left behind a silence that still listens. The metal still remembers. The dreamers still dream. The keepers still keep. Something is still present in the temple, still waiting in the sacred spaces, still humming at the edge of perception for those who have learned to hear. Perhaps the bells are still ringing. Perhaps they never stopped. Perhaps the sound they made that night was not a single note, but the beginning of an endless tone, too vast and too slow for ordinary ears to detect, a ringing that will continue until the end of time, until the last temple crumbles, until the last bronze returns to the earth from which it came. If this is true, then the second ringing is not something we wait for. It is something we enter. It is happening now, has been happening since that night, will continue happening forever. The only question is whether we are listening, whether we have become quiet enough, still enough, present enough to hear what has never stopped being spoken. Let us close this chapter and this journey in the quietest hour of night, standing in a temple where a great bell hangs motionless. The stars turn slowly overhead, the same stars that shifted when the bells first rang. The stone walls hold the memory of centuries, the prayers of generations, the hopes and fears of all the souls who have stood where we stand now. The bell is still. Its surface reflects starlight, ancient light that has traveled unimaginable distances to touch this bronze that was touched once by something equally distant and equally ancient. Inside the metal, something waits. Inside the silence, something listens. Inside the stillness, a vibration too subtle to measure continues its eternal work. Below the bell, a keeper sits in meditation. He has been sitting here for 60 years, night after night, listening for a sound that may never come. He does not mind the waiting. The waiting, he has discovered, is not empty. It is full, full of everything the bells have left behind, full of the silence that is also a presence, full of the attention that receives everything without judgment and holds everything without grasping. He does not need the bells to ring again. He has found, in the waiting itself, everything the ringing promised. He has found peace without resolution, meaning without explanation, presence without destination. This, perhaps, is the secret the bells were teaching all along. Not a message to be decoded, but a practice to be embodied, not an answer to be found, but a question to be lived, not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be embraced, moment by moment, breath by breath, in the sacred dark where all bells ring and all silences speak. The night is deep now. The stars are wheeling toward dawn. Somewhere in the world, a bellkeeper is cleaning ancient bronze. Somewhere, a dreamer is reaching for a message that dissolves upon waking. Somewhere, a traveler is walking between temples, suspended in the sacred space of the journey itself. And somewhere, everywhere, the silence that the bells left behind continues to listen, continues to wait, continues to hold space for whatever might come next. The night every temple bell rang once has passed into the space between memory and myth. What remains is not certainty, but wonder, not explanation, but impulse invitation, not the end of a story, but the beginning of a listening that has no end. Close your eyes now. Let your breath slow. Feel the silence settling around you like snow falling on ancient stone. And listen, not for sound, but for the presence that sound reveals when it falls away. The bells rang once, they are ringing still, and we who have followed this mystery through its many chambers, we are part of the ringing now, part of the listening, part of the endless conversation between the sacred and the seeking, between the silence and the sound, between the question that has no answer and the answer that needs no question. Rest now. The bell is waiting. It has always been waiting. And in your dreams tonight, perhaps you will hear it, the sound that has never stopped, the word that was spoken before you were born, the tone that holds everything you are and everything you will ever be, resonating in the bronze of eternity, ringing in the temple of your own heart. Sleep now. The bell will keep watch. It always has. It always will.